My child, come closer. Like the flickering flames of a fire, some stories are shaped by the winds of time, but some never fade, no matter how old they get. Let me tell you the story of Lancelot, the most loyal friend and the greatest betrayer of King Arthur. But everything has a beginning, right? So come, let me tell you how this great love began. Back in those days, Britain was experiencing its golden age under Arthur's rule. Camelot was where the knights of the Round Table gathered in virtue. They weren't just masters of the sword. They were the men who stood beside kings, not behind them, with honor and loyalty. And on one of those days, a young knight arrived at the palace. His name was Lancelot du Lac, which means Lancelot of the Lake. According to rumors, he was raised by the mysterious Lady of the Lake. Far from his people, he was raised in the embrace of nature and magic. The stories told about him were nothing more than whispers. Some claimed he was a warrior of supernatural strength, while others said he carried the blood of a true king. When Arthur looked him over, he could tell this was no ordinary man. There was fire in Lancelot's stance, in his eyes. He didn't bow, he didn't beg. He stood straight in the king's presence. When he made his vow, his voice rang out. My lord, this sword shall rise for your justice and never serve any tyranny against your will. Arthur smiled. There was no way such a brave and honest knight wouldn't have a place in Camelot. That day Lancelot became a part of the Round Table. But oh, if only he knew the path fate had drawn for him. For on that day, it wasn't just a knight that entered Camelot. On that day, Arthur's greatest tragedy walked into the palace. And here, my child, is where fate begins to weave its twist. The moment Lancelot set foot in Camelot, the threads of destiny began to knot. For that day, he didn't just lay his eyes on a king, he also gazed upon a queen, Guinevere. Even saying her name touches my soul, for she was known as one of the most beautiful women in Britain. But her beauty wasn't just in the elegance of her face. She had a noble spirit. Her eyes were as deep as rivers and as passionate as a storm. Even when sitting next to Arthur, it seemed there was another world within her. A desire for freedom, perhaps the sorrow of a heart that knew it could not escape its fate. Lancelot saw her for the first time in the Great Hall. The knights returning from the battlefield came before Arthur, pledging their loyalty. And there, sitting right beside the throne, was the queen. In that moment, it felt as though time stood still. The crackle of the fires fell silent. The clanking of knights' heavy armor was drowned out by stillness. Lancelot's heart skipped a beat. He had never seen such beauty before. But what was even stranger was that Guinevere was looking at him too. Legend says that this gaze lasted only a moment, but sometimes a single moment feels longer than a lifetime. The queen looked at Lancelot without breaking eye contact. Then she slightly lowered her head in a gesture of greeting, and in that instant, the seed of love began to sprout. Some tellings say that in that very moment, Guinevere felt a tremor deep within her heart. In the magic of that moment, no one knew what would come next. Lancelot had sworn loyalty to his queen as a knight, but deep down, he realized his soul was betraying him. He knew he couldn't forget those eyes. That elegance would never leave his mind. Now listen carefully, my child, for not every story is told in just one way. Some ancient sagas describe this encounter differently. Some say that Guinevere fell in love with Lancelot the moment she laid eyes on him. Others claim that the love grew over time, unnoticed. In some old songs, their first meeting takes place in a garden. As the sun sets, Lancelot and Guinevere cross paths. The wind sweeps Guinevere's hair as Lancelot holds his breath for a moment. Who knows? Maybe it was the whim of the gods. But no matter which version of the story is true, the outcome is the same. Their paths crossed, and fate was now chasing them, This love wasn't just a spark in their hearts, it was opening a crack in Arthur's throne and in the future of Britain. Ah, my child, great loves always come with great destruction, and this was just the beginning. Now, take a breath before I continue, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a love story, it's a tale of betrayal, the collapse of friendship, and the destiny of a kingdom. Ah, my child, sit once more by the fire. I told you, some stories do not drift with the winds of time. They stand like rocks, like monuments planted firmly in the heart of history. And Lancelot's story is one of those tales. He was not just a warrior, nor just a man, but a legend. But within every legend there is always a tragedy, isn't there? For every great hero holds a crack in their heart, and that crack is nurtured by the hand of fate. Lancelot was known as one of Camelot's brightest knights, but what set him apart wasn't just his courage on the battlefield. No, he was more than a sword. What made him a legend was his unshakable loyalty. The oath of the Knights of the Round Table was based on honor above all else. A knight must stand by the side of the helpless, protect the weak, and stand firm against injustice. But beyond all that, they had but one master, King Arthur. Arthur's will was like law to them, and Lancelot stayed true to this oath for his entire life. On the battlefield, when he charged toward his enemies, the mere mention of his name would strike fear into the hearts of all who heard it. His sword was not only sharp, but also powerful, because the hand that wielded it never trembled. But strangely enough, my child, it is far easier to win battles outside oneself than it is to conquer the wars within. Lancelot could overthrow kings and conquer castles, but could he control his own heart? That, my dear, was the true question. No one ever doubted his loyalty to Arthur. He loved him not just as a king, but as a friend. Arthur wasn't just a ruler, he embodied an ideal. He was the symbol of justice, of peace, and the golden age of Camelot. By standing by him, Lancelot was not merely a servant of a king, he was a guardian of a dream. But fate had other plans. Ah, child, now take a deep breath, for what I'm about to tell you is not just a story of loyalty, it's also a tale of a heart split in two. Lancelot, yes, felt an eternal devotion to Arthur, but in a corner of his heart, another fire was burning. Guinevere. The quiet flutter he felt when he first met her had long since grown into a storm. She was Arthur's wife, the Queen of Camelot. Just looking into her eyes was perhaps a betrayal. But when fate binds two souls, no matter how strong the will of the people, it becomes impossible to sever that connection. Each day, each night, Lancelot fought the same battle within his mind. On one side there was Arthur's friendship, the love of a king who had embraced him like a son. On the other, an undeniable love that he could not silence or deny. Guinevere was in the same war. As the days passed, the line between the respect she had for Arthur and the passion she felt for Lancelot began to blur. No matter how much they tried to deny it, eventually denial proved futile. According to some stories, Lancelot tried for a long time to suppress his love. Under Arthur's shadow, he didn't want to betray his sense of justice or virtue. But love, my child, love winds itself around a soul like a chain. The man who was undefeated on the greatest battlefields is brought to his knees by a single glance. Arthur always trusted Lancelot. He saw him as a brother, and perhaps that was the true tragedy. For when a person betrays the one they love most, the price is not just a battle, but the downfall of an entire kingdom. You know, in some versions of the tale, Lancelot is even said to have drawn his sword against Arthur in order to protect Guinevere. Can you imagine that? To raise a sword against the very king he had sworn loyalty to. That must have been the hardest decision a man could ever make. But such is life, my child. The greatest loves come with the greatest destruction. And Lancelot's loyalty was not only to Arthur, it was also to Guinevere. And at one point, those two loyalties destroyed one another. Ah, sometimes I think if Lancelot had never known Arthur, perhaps things would have been different. Or perhaps if he and Guinevere had never crossed paths. But history is not written with what ifs, is it? What is written is written, and fate had chosen another path for him. Now, before I continue with the rest of the story, stoke the fire a bit more, my child, for what I'm about to tell you is not the tale of a love, but of a betrayal and a fall. Ah, my child, come closer to the fire. For what I'm about to tell you is not only the tale of love, but also the story of an inner war, the division of a heart into two different worlds, the inevitable fate caught between a woman's loneliness and a man's unshakable loyalty. Camelot was always magnificent. Its great stone walls, towers that gleamed like gold, and its grand palace made it seem like a fairy tale kingdom. But do you know, my child, even the greatest of palaces can sometimes turn into the coldest of dungeons, especially when a heart carries deep loneliness within it. Guinevere was a queen, Arthur's wife, the crown of Camelot, the symbol of splendor and order. But these titles were not enough to fill the emptiness within a person. Arthur as a king was just and brave, but as a husband, here is where the story changes. A ruler bears a heavy load upon his shoulders. Arthur was constantly at war, carrying the sword of justice. He was the pillar of Camelot, but as a husband, he could not spend enough time with Guinevere. The stone walls of the palace turned into a golden cage for him. You can be lonely even in a crowd, my child. And that was exactly what Guinevere was experiencing. Then, one day, he arrived. Lancelot. He was Arthur's most loyal knight, but also, perhaps, the cruelest game of fate. Lancelot's arrival in Camelot was not just the entrance of a warrior into the city. It was the weaving of the first threads of an unavoidable destiny. At first, Lancelot was only a protector. He stood by the queen, shielding her from danger, acting with unwavering loyalty to his duty. But sometimes, my child, sometimes the human heart overflows with emotions that were never expected. For Guinevere, Lancelot was more than just a knight. He became a symbol of trust, loyalty, and peace. When Arthur was away on the battlefield, it was always Lancelot who protected her. As days passed, their conversations grew longer. Their eyes unwillingly began to look deeper into each other's. But back then, they both believed it was only a friendship. Yes, just friendship. But can a person deceive themselves, my child? Days passed, seasons changed, and with each passing day, the loneliness inside Guinevere grew. Lancelot, too, felt himself growing more attached to her, but neither of them ever spoke of it. How could they? Guinevere was a queen, Arthur's wife, the pride of Camelot. Lancelot was a knight loyal to her king. But you see, the heart is a battlefield, my child. No matter how strong the walls you build, some feelings will always find a way to break through those walls. At first, their glances were quickly averted. When they stood close, their words remained measured. But over time, this distance turned into agony. Guinevere felt safe in Lancelot's presence, knowing she was no longer alone by his side. Lancelot, on the other hand, struggled to suppress his feelings, but each time, the storm inside him grew fiercer. One evening, I cannot help but tell you about this moment. As they walked in the palace garden, Guinevere suddenly stopped. She sighed softly and gazed at the sky. Lancelot saw the sadness on her face but said nothing. For sometimes words are unnecessary. Sometimes simply being silent and feeling the moment is enough. Guinevere gently lowered her head and whispered, "All right, sometimes even a queen can be lonely, Lancelot." In that moment, one of the walls inside Lancelot fell, for he knew. In that instant, his heart was no longer solely Arthur's, it was also Guinevere's. But this had to remain a secret. For this love could not shine in the light of day. It could only exist in whispered corners of the darkness. But no matter how much you try to hide it, the flame will always grow, my child. And once it ignites, it can never be extinguished. And so, a love was born. But this love was also the beginning of a catastrophe. Stoke the fire a bit more, my child. For from here on, what I will tell you will not only be a tale of love, but also of emotions that turned into betrayal. My child, come closer. Let the flames of the fire warm your face. For the tale I am about to share is not only the story of a love, it is also a knot where honor, morality, and fate intertwine. One of the hardest trials of the human heart. Listen carefully to how a love can turn into a sin, and a sin into destruction. For, alas, not every great love ends with a happy ending worthy of songs. Some leave behind dreams reduced to ashes. The Middle Ages. It is harsh, ruthless, a time when destinies were trapped between stone walls. People feared God, obeyed their kings, and would rather starve than break moral codes. For sin could destroy not only your soul but your very name. Kings ruled not only with their swords, but also with their laws and their honor. And one of the most sacred things was marriage. A queen, in addition to being a king's wife, had to be a symbol of purity. A woman's loyalty defined not just her soul, but the reputation of an entire kingdom. Therefore, the greatest mistake a queen could make was to succumb to love, especially if that love was for another. The forbidden passion between Lancelot and Guinevere was a violation of these very rules. Their love was not just a betrayal, it was a scandal that could shake the kingdom. Once whispers began, they spread like wildfire, igniting everything in their path. For the palace was not only a place of grandeur, but also a breeding ground for gossip. At that time, love was not a free feeling, my child. Love had to be lived within the confines of rules. A man and a woman were wed in a manner accepted by society and the church, pledging loyalty to each other. But what if oaths went against the heart's command? What if a person strayed from the path that fate had drawn for them? That is, when even palaces that seemed like heaven would turn into prisons. And Lancelot and Guinevere's love was born in such a prison. At first, no one noticed anything. Lancelot was always by Arthur's side, seen as Camelot's most loyal warrior. His deep affection for the queen was never questioned. It was accepted as the devotion a knight had for his lord. But, no matter how silent people try to be, their eyes always seek the truth. The stone walls of the palace do not only hide sounds, they also conceal whispers. And one whisper can, over time, turn into a shout. At first, there were only brief glances, perhaps some lingering silences. No one said anything, for no one had definitive proof. But sometimes, a feeling alone is enough. The servants in the palace began to notice how Guinevere's eyes would linger after Lancelot. Sometimes the knight was seen staying by the queen's side longer than the others. These were small things, but when combined, they were enough to write a story. And then, the whispers began. Do you think they meet too often? Is Lancelot just a knight, or does he feel a different kind of loyalty toward the queen? The echoes of footsteps in the palace corridors late at night. Who was speaking with whom? The whispers grew. Suspicions multiplied, and those in the high ranks of the palace knew very well that even the slightest rumor could spark a war. Arthur's most trusted advisors slowly began to turn their attention to the matter. A king may be powerful, but sometimes his greatest enemy is not outside, but within his own palace. Meanwhile, Arthur was occupied with wars. To defend his kingdom, to protect the future of Camelot, he was armed for battle. His mind was focused on the fields of war, enemy armies, and the strength of his dynasty. Love? Love was just a minor matter to him. He loved Guinevere, of course, but he could not afford to give her the attention she needed. And as the emptiness inside Guinevere grew, the fire within Lancelot continued to burn. Ah, my child, sometimes the greatest betrayals arise from the most innocent of feelings, and the greatest love stories are often destined for the most tragic endings. But every beginning has its own start, and every start could be the first step toward a catastrophe. From here on, what I will tell you will not only be the story of a love, but also of the shaking of an empire. For betrayal is not just something that happens between two hearts. Sometimes it determines the fate of an entire kingdom. Now rest for a while, my child, but not for too long. For soon, I will tell you how this love will turn into a burning fire. Ah, my child, a kingdom is ruled not only with swords, but with the sharpness of minds. And the greatest enemy of a ruler is not always distant armies or barbaric invaders. Sometimes danger comes from the closest, most unexpected places. And thus, Arthur's kingdom was facing such a treacherous threat. Morgan Le Fay. Morgan, even her name echoes like dark whispers. She was not just a woman, she was the very embodiment of magic, ambition, and betrayal. The hatred she held for Arthur, her own flesh and blood, was so great that it could freeze hearts. And to bring him pain, she didn't just play with swords, but with minds, hearts, and desires. For sometimes, to bring down a kingdom, there is no need to spill blood. A single whisper, a single doubt, a single conspiracy can destroy an entire empire. Morgan Le Fay was Arthur's half-sister, but she had never approached him with real familial affection. The difference in their fathers had fostered a deep anger and jealousy within her. As Arthur ascended the throne, this anger turned into hatred and a vow to bring him down, to make him suffer by using the power of dark magic. But listen wisely, my child. Morgan did not only move with magic. Her intelligence was deadlier than the sharpest sword. She was like a spider, using the desires and weaknesses of people to turn them against one another. And sadly, Camelot's greatest weakness was Arthur's most loyal friend and his beautiful queen. Morgan had long noticed Arthur's preoccupation with wars, his days spent on the battlefield, and the emptiness growing in Guinevere's heart. But more importantly, she had sensed the fire in Lancelot's gaze, how he looked at the queen. It was then that she formed her plan. If she could expose the forbidden love between Arthur's most trusted knight and his wife, the kingdom would be plunged into chaos. To achieve this, she unleashed her magic, her spies, and her most cunning schemes. First, she identified the weakest links in the palace. Some of the servants who attended to the queen were bought with gold and whispered poisons. Carefully, rumors began to spread about Lancelot's interest in the queen. At first, these were just whispers, but Morgan's hand was so skilled that these rumors quickly became the talk of the palace. But this was just the beginning, for Morgan wanted to plant doubt, not just among the people, but in Arthur's very heart. And so she put into motion her most devious plan. One day Morgan used her magic to send Arthur a dream. The dream was bloody, terrifying. Arthur was walking inside his castle, but everything around him was in ruins. Stones were crumbled, the walls were covered in blood, and in front of him, Guinevere and Lancelot were locked in each other's embrace, burning in flames. The moment Arthur awoke, he knew this dream was not a mere nightmare. He felt a deep unease grow within him. Something was wrong. And this is how Morgan first poisoned Arthur's mind. But there was more. Morgan knew that one night Lancelot would secretly visit the queen. She knew this because she had arranged for it herself. One of the servants delivered a false message to Guinevere, claiming that Arthur urgently needed to speak with her. Likewise, another message was sent to Lancelot, informing him that Guinevere was in great danger and needed to see him immediately. And so the most cruel knot of fate was tied. Lancelot, with fear in his heart, entered the queen's chamber and Guinevere was equally stunned. But at that moment, just at that moment, the doors flung open. One of Arthur's most trusted men entered with a few guards. And there they were, Lancelot and Guinevere, alone in the room, caught in what seemed like an intimate moment. For the people of Camelot, this was an undeniable scandal. The queen being found alone with the most loyal knight in the dead of night was in itself a terrible accusation. The whispers grew louder, and suspicions turned into undeniable truths. Arthur, now unable to ignore the poisonous doubt that had awoken within him, had no choice but to accept it as reality. Morgan Le Fay's plot had succeeded, and that night, Camelot would never be the same again. Ah, my child, now stop and think. Sometimes the greatest betrayals are the result of the most insidious games. Morgan Le Fay had managed to bring down Arthur's kingdom from within without using a single sword or fighting a battle. For the greatest destructions often begin with the revelation of the most unexpected emotions. But know this, the story does not end here. What I will tell you next will not be the end of a love, but the downfall of an empire. For the webs of betrayal, revenge, and fate are always being woven. Ah, my child, remember this. It is not the enemies from outside that bring down the greatest kingdoms, but the seeds of discord that grow from within. Even the strongest walls cannot withstand the betrayal that blossoms inside. Camelot, too, was facing such a silent but deep threat. And this threat had a name. Mordred. Mordred. Arthur's blood, but never his heart. Arthur's nephew, yet a man so ambitious and ruthless that one day he would covet his throne. History may only remember his name as that of a traitor, but do not forget, my child, that no betrayal is without reason. And sometimes betrayal is born not from a man's ambition alone, but from the anger he nurtures, the years of neglect, and the opportunity that one day presents itself. This is what stoked the fire burning within Mordred. In his eyes, Arthur was no hero. He was a king who rejected even his own blood. He was determined to stain Camelot's shining light with shadows. But great falls never happen with a single blow. Sometimes the first step to a fall is a tiny seed of doubt. And this doubt lay in the forbidden love between Guinevere and Lancelot. Mordred had been waiting for a long time. He observed carefully, noting everything before making a move. He wasn't just a man who fought with a sword. He had a mind that could read people, see their weaknesses, and magnify even the smallest crack with subtlety. As rumors about Lancelot and Guinevere spread through the palace, an opportunity arose for Mordred. He was patient enough not to make direct accusations, for he was like a snake, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when that moment came, he would poison the minds of those around him. He began to build friendly rapport with the palace servants and knights. But these conversations appeared to be nothing more than casual exchanges. Mordred made sure people trusted him. With small tricks, he drank with some, rode horses with others, and confided in a few. In return, they began to open up to him. He learned when Guinevere and Lancelot walked together in the same garden, when their eyes met, and which knights had seen them side by side. But most importantly, he tried to understand how Arthur was responding to all these rumors. Was Arthur ignoring them? Or was the shadow of doubt growing in his heart? And then Mordred made a great discovery. Arthur, despite being a mighty king, was weak on this matter. He wanted to believe in Guinevere, but with each passing day, the growing rumors left a shadow in his heart. When Mordred realized this, he knew he had found Arthur's greatest vulnerability. And for a traitor, the king's weakness is the most powerful weapon. Doubt is like a disease, my child. Once it enters a person, it begins to gnaw at them. And if it spreads within a kingdom, there is no need for armies to tear it apart. And this is exactly what happened in Camelot. Slowly, two groups began to form within the palace. On one side, there were those who believed in Lancelot. They trusted his honor, courage, and loyalty to the king. Lancelot had been Camelot's greatest hero for years. He had stood beside Arthur in the toughest battles, defeated enemies, and fought for the kingdom with his sword. Could such a man be guilty of treason? But on the other side, there was a group stirred by Mordred's whispers. They began to believe the rumors were true. "What does a man do spending so much time with the queen?" they asked. "Why does Guinevere's gaze turn to him when Arthur is not around?" Thus, the cracks within Camelot deepened. Even knights, who once fought side by side, now viewed each other with suspicion. And Mordred, he just watched. For the best games are sometimes played with patience. To further strengthen Arthur's suspicions, Mordred began to make small moves. One night he whispered into Arthur's ear, "Majesty, we are all confident in our loyalty, but do you know? In the last few nights, Lancelot's horse has stayed in the castle courtyard far longer than usual. Perhaps, before any misunderstandings grow, it's time to clarify a few things." Arthur couldn't sleep that night, and at that moment, the crack in Arthur's heart began to turn into an abyss. "My child, you must understand, no kingdom falls in a single night. A love, a betrayal, a grudge builds up over time. Arthur's Camelot had begun to crumble in this way, and Mordred knew the moment he had been waiting for was approaching. One day, Arthur and Lancelot would face each other. One day, Guinevere would be brought before justice. One day, Camelot's great brilliance would fade into darkness. And on that day, Mordred would be smiling with his sword in hand. For betrayal is not just an act. Sometimes it is an art, crafted over time. But remember, my child, this story does not end here. What comes next will be the final act of both a love and a betrayal. And I will tell you how that final act was written. Ah, my child, sometimes fate is woven with the finest threads, and in the blink of an eye, those threads begin to unravel. Mighty kingdoms, alliances that seem unbreakable, great loves, all of these can be undone in the span of a single moment. And on that night, Camelot was shaken to its core. The love between Lancelot and Guinevere was no longer just a whisper. Mordred and his cunning schemes had fed the doubt growing inside Arthur, and the scent of their forbidden love had reached even the deepest corners of the palace. But kings do not rule by gossip. A king seeks to see, a king demands proof. And Arthur, painful as it was determined to find that proof. Sometimes, what ends a love is not the sword of an enemy, but a moment's carelessness. And on that night, betrayal would be etched into history as one of the most painful nights ever lived. The night had fallen over Camelot. In the corridors of the castle, only the flickering light of torches danced. The scent of roses in the palace gardens drifted on a light breeze, while the stone walls stood in silence like an ancient secret. But that night, that silence would soon turn into a storm. Agina and Lancelot, the queen and her most loyal knight, drawn to one another once more, their forbidden love casting a shadow. What bound them together was not just their passion, it was the freedom they felt in those moments when they shed the weight of the world. In a love born beneath Arthur's shadow, time would stop and reality would fade. But no matter how long time might stop, the price of betrayal must be paid eventually. That night, Mordred and his men lay in wait. They had carefully observed, time and time again, where Guinevere and Lancelot met, how they spoke, and when they left the palace. Patience is the greatest weapon, my child, and Mordred, with his patience, was ready to strike with the deadliest blow. There was a hidden passage leading to Guinevere's private chambers. Few knew of it, but Lancelot, whenever he came to see the queen, would use this passage. That night was no different. He was not wearing his armor, and his sword was left behind. For this was not a battle, it was a surrender to love. And then in that moment a shadow moved. Suddenly the doors were flung open. In the light of the torches, Arthur's most trusted knights appeared at the doorway. Swords were drawn and shouts filled the air. Lancelot instinctively reached for his sword, but what he saw before him was Arthur's face, filled with anguish. Queen Guinevere stood frozen. Not a single word escaped her lips, for here there was no love anymore, only betrayal. My child, in that moment, Camelot's foundation trembled, for this was not merely the revelation of a love affair. This was the undeniable proof that the two people Arthur trusted most had betrayed him right before his eyes. The knights rushed toward Lancelot. Arthur paused for a moment. The trust he had built for years collapsed in an instant. He looked at Guinevere. Those eyes, the eyes he had once seen love in, now only reflected fear. Lancelot du Lac, Arthur's voice trembled. What you've done is not only a betrayal to me, but to Camelot itself. Lancelot knelt. He would never draw his sword against his king. Arthur was his one and only master. But this love had dragged him into treachery. Majesty, Lancelot whispered, no matter what you say, my life is yours to take. But know this, there is no treason in this love. My heart remains loyal to you. But Arthur's heart was not in a place to hear those words. Camelot's most loyal knight was now seen as a traitor. Guinevere, despite being queen, was now a criminal. The palace was in shock. Mordred's plan had worked flawlessly. The next day, in Camelot's square, it was announced that Guinevere would be burned at the stake. The queen, once admired by all, was now a criminal. And Lancelot had to flee. But could a knight leave behind the woman he loved? Arthur's decision regarding Lancelot and Guinevere would determine Camelot's future. And this decision would not just end a love, it would end a kingdom. But know this, my child, Camelot's end was not yet here. The greatest battle was still to be fought. Ah, my child, you must understand that to be a king is not just about wielding a sword and winning battles. A true king wins his greatest victories not on the battlefield, but by wrestling with the storms in his own heart. And that, my child, is where Arthur's greatest battle lay. Not against Saxon invaders or treacherous lords. His greatest struggle was the conflict between his love for Guinevere and the laws of Camelot. As a king, he had to uphold justice. But as a husband, my child, as a husband, his heart was not ready to bear such pain. The betrayal of Guinevere and Lancelot had been exposed. In every corner of the palace there was but one whisper. The queen would be judged, and she would pay the price for her treason. Arthur sat in the throne room, his gold-embroidered cloak fallen from his shoulders, lost in heavy thought. Before him stood a long wooden table, intricately carved with designs. On this table, decisions had been made over the years that shaped the future of Camelot. But tonight, the only decision before him was one that would tear his heart apart. Gawain, Bedivere, Kay, and the other loyal knights stood silently around him. They too knew this was their king's hardest trial. The law states that anyone who betrays the king shall be punished by death, Bedivere said, his voice trembling with respect. But she is our queen. Arthur lifted his head. In his blue eyes, the storms within him were clear for all to see. I know, Bedivere. She is my queen, and she is my Guinevere, he whispered. But then he slammed his fist on the table. But the laws of Camelot must come above my feelings. If justice only protects those closest to me, then I have no right to sit on this throne. There was silence. Arthur's voice hung in the air like heavy iron. In that moment, every knight understood that their greatest enemy was not Mordred's plots or the dangers outside. His greatest enemy was the love of the past that still haunted his heart. But justice must be greater than a king's heart. That day, Camelot's square was filled with thousands of people. The crowd gathered in the shadow of the towers, holding their breath, their eyes fixed on the balcony of the throne. For today, their queen would be judged. Arthur stepped forward, his pace heavy. He wore no armor, his sword Excalibur absent from his side. Today, he was not a warrior, he was a judge. And this burden weighed on him as heavily as the thickest armor. Guinevere, clad in her gold-embroidered gown, was brought forward, walking slowly. Her head was held high. In her eyes, there was neither fear nor regret. She was ready to pay the price for her love. Arthur looked into her eyes. He searched for the love he had seen there for so many years. But now, all he saw was acceptance. He took a deep breath and declared the laws of Camelot. "Queen Guinevere," he said, his voice as hard as steel but carrying the weight of hidden pain. "According to the laws of Camelot, those who betray the sovereign are punished by death. And as the sworn protector of this throne, I must administer justice." The crowd fell into complete silence. A gust of wind blew, and Arthur spoke the sharpest part of the blade. "Therefore, Queen Guinevere, you are sentenced to death." A murmur spread through the crowd. People whispered. Even the knights averted their eyes, for everyone knew that this decision was like a dagger to Arthur's heart. Guinevere bowed her head. She accepted. She was ready to pay the price for her love. But my child, Camelot's greatest love would not end here, for fate still had one final play to make. Ah, my child, the story of Camelot is never just about a war, a love, or a betrayal. It is a place where the greatest desires and deepest fears of the people are shaped. Did Arthur give up his love for the sake of justice? Yes. But somewhere deep within, was there still a part of him that wanted to save Guinevere and Lancelot? Would he leave the woman he loved to the embrace of death? No. Camelot's bravest knight would once again don his sword for his queen and change the fate of Camelot forever. But remember, my child, sometimes love cannot save a kingdom, and sometimes justice cannot forgive a love. That, my child, is the harshest truth of Camelot.